Hey everybody, welcome to the lecture on the wildland-urban interface. Today we're going to talk about one of the spaces that we see a lot in places like California, but also around the world. We're going to talk a little bit about what the wildland-urban interface is, why we care about it, and some of the policies that are out there that affect us around the wildland-urban interface. So let's go ahead and get into it. All right, the wildland-urban interface, also what I'll refer to as the WUI. You'll hear that a lot in readings and things along those lines. So part of what we've already talked about is the fire behavior triangle. We talked about that when we started talking about urban spaces, and how fuels, weather, and topography really impact fire behavior. But just to kind of go through and remind you about this, so fuels is what's on the ground, and that is both in terms of moisture, size, airflow. Weather is how hot or dry, what season is it? When was the last precipitation event? Is it a place that has fog? How hot is it out? And then topography is what the landscape looks like. And this is especially important when we think about the wildland-urban interface, because we know things that like canyons and hills can actually drive wind and heat to send the fire up the hill, right? Heat rises that Holton fires as well. And so really thinking through how these things come to play, and also the types of building decision processes that humans make in relation to those spaces, right? Nothing like a great view at the top of a hill, especially here. If you get the right hill, you can see the ocean from your house, and it's beautiful and wonderful. But did you think about what the fire that might come onto your land might do given the place where you built your house? Have you thought through, is fire going to travel up faster? How much wind do you regularly get that might drive the fire up the hill towards your house if you built on the top of the hill? Did you build your house far enough back? Do you have a big enough fire break? Have you built your house in a way that makes it more resistant to fire? What does your landscaping look like? How close is that to your house? What kind of water sources do you have? All of these impact how we think about this second behavior in terms, the second triangle, our fire behavior triangle, in terms of the WUI. So let's talk about what is the WUI. So when we think through the wildlands, this is from Community Planning Assistance for Wildfire. And if you want to know more, here is actually their website. And it talks about the continuum of wildland to urban densities. So when we talk about the wildland-urban interface, we're usually talking somewhere around this rural to suburban location. So it goes from wildlands where we don't have any human habitation, to rural where we have some human habitation. Suburban, we have spread out human habitation, right? The spaces between these houses are bigger. We have general residencies where we have more tightly packed places, and then we have urban spaces or town centers that are usually much more dense in their housing, and in their building structures and how you get around those spaces. But it's also in relationship to the amount of vegetation that you have in those spaces. So you can see here on the wildlands, lots of vegetation. Same within rural spaces and even suburban spaces. We start to have a lot more of this wildland interface with suburban spaces. So this is the continuum we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about what is the WUI. The WUI is happening in between this rural and suburban space. So there are three different types of wildland-urban interfaces that we talk about. We talk about interface, intermix, and occlusion. So these are usually thought about in terms of density of houses, how close they are to the wildlands, and we're going to actually talk about each one. But one of the important resources we have is our Fire and Resource Assessment Program. This is by CAL FIRE. They have tons of information on here, including fire hazard and severity zone maps. And then we're actually going to look at the fire hazard zone map in a sec. So this is the September 29th, 2023 state responsibility area fire hazard severity maps. So even though we had a lot of places come out of drought and everything like that, this is what CAL FIRE is measuring as the areas that are that are highest, that they are responsible for. So there's these areas where you're like, there's like nothing in the San Joaquin Valley or in San Bernardino. And that's because a lot of those areas are actually under federal responsibility, as opposed to state responsibility. So these are the state maps. And we can look at, they have maps for each and every one of the counties. So here is San Luis Obispo's. This is our hazard map. And again, very high is pink, high is orange, yellow is moderate. These green areas are federal responsibility areas. So we have Los Padres National Park. That's a lot of this. Down here in like Napomo, Rio Grande, Grover Beach, San Luis Obispo proper, Atascadero, Templeton, and Paso, those have local areas of responsibility. So it's up to Rio Grande, it's up to San Luis Obispo to assess their risk. And you can see that there's a lot of areas, even though we're technically out of drought, that still have very high severity, including, go in even more here. So over in this area, right? So this is water bodies. This is the lake in San Luis Obispo. You can see this is one. So we're like right in here, right? So this is us. Here at Cal Poly, we're in this orange area for our assessment, as opposed to this yellow area going into Los Osos. And then we have a lot of the mountain areas, especially up over here. This is Twitchell Reservoir. This is Lopez Lake. All those areas are very high. So when you're doing a wildland urban interface assessment and you're thinking about what the risks are, these hazard maps are really important to look at because they really do give you a feel of what these risks are, who is at risk. This also impacts, by the way, fire insurance. So a lot of places that are in this wildland urban interface that are high risk, it's really expensive, if you can get it at all, to get fire insurance. And that has a lot of implications we'll talk about later in the lecture. All right, so those are the FRAP maps. So let's talk about the interface first. All right, the interface is exactly what it sounds like. You see how there's this boundary that goes clearly around this housing development. This has a clear interface. So this is areas with housing and low density vegetation within fire's reach, within 1.5 miles of a large contiguous block of wildland vegetation. So this is a good example. You have this dense housing surrounded by vegetation. So housing density classes for wildland urban interface comes in 4 levels. So level 1 is less than 1 house per 20 acres. That's rural, right? Class 2 is 1 house per 20 acres to 1 house per 5 acres. Class 3 is more than 5 acres per 1 house. And class 4 is more than 1 house per acre. So these interfaces, how densely packed these how densely packed this housing is, impacts the density class. So this is probably a class 4. You can see that there is definitely more than one house per acre, right? They still have nice yards and everything like that, but this isn't an acre. It's probably about a third of an acre per house. So this is an example of a class 4. Often these interfaces are in moderate, high, or very high fire hazard zones, and that is based on this vegetation. Now, this development itself is not dominated by vegetation because it's been cut out. It's not, they didn't just leave the trees all in this area. This is clearly a housing development. So it is not dominated by this wildland vegetation. So this is an interface. So the intermix is where housing intermingles with wildland vegetation. And Cambria, here in San Luis Obispo County, is an excellent example of this. So you can see here in beautiful Cambria, I highly recommend you go there. You can see how we've got this pretty large contiguous area of wildland, and you can see how there's all of these houses that have been built right in the forest, which makes it an amazing place to live and also makes it an amazingly dangerous place to live. So the intermix housing development is interspersed in an area dominated by wildland vegetation, which is subject to wildfire, and it needs to meet these criteria. First, it's not an interface. You see how there's not this, if you had like a clear-cut boundary here, and all of these houses were visible, that would be an interface. This is intermixed. Housing density is class 3 or 4. So that's more than one house per 5 acres to one house per acre, or more, or even more than that, more than one house per acre. And the landscape is dominated by the wildland vegetation, which is clearly what the case is here in Cambria. This is an Monterey pine, oak, and manzanita dominated forest. This is actually one of the last of the 5 native, this is one of 5 native pine stands for Monterey pines. And part of the issue here, there's been some fires actually up there in 2023 near this area that has been of great concern for people, because if a fire gets into this intermix, all of this is going to go. We're going to watch the Paradise Fire video, and Paradise was very much an intermix as well. Now, there's been some interesting stuff done out in Cambria. There is a fuels treatment project that has been underway out there at one of the ranches. So this is actually the Corvallis Ranch up in Cambria. And this is one of the fuels treatment projects that we've seen through CAL FIRE in their CAL VTP project for fuels reduction. And part of the goal here, so this is a fairly large ranch in Cambria, and they haven't had fire out there in quite some time, which frankly is a good thing. Remember, I showed you how all those houses are intermixed into that space. But the ranch actually wanted to have a bit of a reduction in its fuels to make it a little bit safer, a little bit more manageable. And they've actually done a pretty amazing job out there. I actually was part of a workshop that went out there. So we start with this picture over here. This is what the density of fuels looked like on the ranch. These two pictures are actually on the opposite sides of the road from each other. So this is one side of the road. This is not part of the ranch. So this was not treated. And you can see a couple important things. One, we have quite a dense litter duff down here. We also have a lot of dead in here. And then we have what are called ladder fuels. All of these brushes, all this brush can lead right up into the canopy and get into the canopy and actually cause a crown fire. Crown fires move a lot faster than ground fires. They're much easier for the wind to blow. You're more likely to get ember blow coming from them, so the embers can actually travel for quite some distance. And so what they decided to do is they had proposed to remove excess understory and really small diameter trees. Any tree that was under, I believe, 8 inches in diameter was removed. At first, there was a lot of controversy around removing trees, a number of trees that were 8 inches in diameter. People like, oh, that's going to be too much and everything like that. And the people who were running this project, this is Steve Otten's company, who is actually running this project, went to them and said, okay, well, let me show you what it looks like. Give me an acre that I can remove the 8 inches, and you tell me what you think. This is part of that original acre. And they looked at this and they're like, yeah, do that. This is amazing. You can see that there's pretty significant spacing between trees. You have a lot more exposure of the understory and the ground. They're still dead there. There's still burn piles. They kept a lot of the chipping in that space, but they overall just cleared this out a lot more. And the people at the ranch actually really love what became of it. It's really shifted what is growing at this ranch. There's a lot more wildflowers, especially with all the rains. This was done a couple years ago. And so this year with all the rains, they discovered a whole lot of flowers that they haven't seen growing there in decades. Suddenly came back. Because they had a lot more sun exposure, a lot more openness. Yes, they had more grass, but they also were able to kind of keep an eye on that. And if they needed to, they could go out and continue doing some manual removal. But you can see that this forest and this forest, which are across the street from each other, look very different. All right, so then we have occluded. So an occluded community generally exists within a city where the structures abut to an island of wildland fuels. So for our example here, we're going to go up to the East Bay into the Oakland Hills. You can see in this map, Oakland, Berkeley, that's this area up in here, Hayward. And you can see that there are these significantly beautiful, wonderful areas of wildland that are up here, right? So here's Mountain Diablo State Park, Pleasanton Ridge, there's trails up here, but these are all pretty significant and large areas of wildlands. They're not treated like a small park where somebody goes out and mows the lawn every week or anything like that. These are actually wildland spaces. And so what you have here is an example of a fire that is occurring. This is the Oakland Hills fire. This happens in 1991. And I actually remember seeing this fire because I lived in the Bay Area at the time. Although I lived in the South Bay, you could actually see the smoke and orange glow coming up from the significance of this fire. So what happened was that a fire originates up in here. This is a grass fire. This is happening up here in this area. This is in Claremont Canyon. And I want you to notice a couple things here. There's like a couple main roads, right? There's 24 and there's 13, and there's this spaghetti of roads in here. And this has all this housing that occurs. So here in the park, you have a fire starts, and it starts around 11:15 a.m. on a Sunday. And so this fire gets going, and it is a windy day and it's a dry day. This is in September, and just like here in San Luis Obispo County, up in the Bay Area, we also don't usually get a lot of rain until November, December. And so the ground is pretty dry. So you have the fire start and it spreads out. Now, all of this is housing. So there's a couple other important things, right? Here is a road out of this development. Here is a road for these houses out of this development. And here is a road out of this development. There's about 1,500 houses in this development. This is a big development. There are 3 exits. And this creates a really significant problem for people trying to get out and away from this fire that is coming pretty fast. It also creates a really big problem for fire trucks trying to get in there to fight this fire, because there are almost no entrance and exit points. So this fire occurs in 1991. You can see how it spread over time. And they were able to get a handle on it before it got too far out, right? Here's Berkeley. But it was still a very significant fire. And part of it occurred because, like I said, this starts as a grass fire in this wildland space and moves into an urbanized space. So it's in a city, it's in Oakland. But the city has a lot of wildland. So it's not like a big contiguous wildland that you're building into. This is smatterings of wildland that have been left behind with development. So this is an example of an occluded space. So potential of fire. How do we think about wildland urban interface and fires in general, and the potential? So we start with dead fuel moisture. We've talked about fuel moisture in a couple different lectures, but really to think about when we think about wildland urban interface, which is, we're concerned about forest fires and we're concerned about rural fires. I'm not diminishing those. We are concerned about them. But these WUI fires we're really concerned about because a lot of times they're happening in places that have a lot of people and a lot of housing. And so part of what we think about when we're thinking through fire warnings and fire potential and understanding fire behavior, we want to think of dead fuel moisture, because dead fuel moisture predicts rate of speed, flame length, and intensity. And of course, the drier the fuel, the hotter and faster the fire is going to go. Moisture of extinction is when fuels are too wet to burn. So if it just rained, if we just had a really dense fog come in, a lot of the fuels are pretty moist. Their odds of burning goes down precipitously. We talked about ways that we need to think through fire regimes, right? We talked about the fact that in the afternoon, fuels are drier. And so that the moisture of extinction is part of what we're thinking about when we're thinking about dead fuel moisture. This also, by the way, impacts when we can and cannot do prescribed burns. Prescribed burns are really carefully planned, and usually you'll get a notice that says sometime in the week of November 6th, we're going to do a prescribed burn in this area. Or we're planning to do a prescribed burn over the next 2 to 3 days. Well, what they're looking at is dead fuel moisture to decide when is the appropriate time to start that burn and to keep that burn safe. So the size of the fuels and whether it impacts burn potential. When there is higher humidity, fuels have more moisture, thus they're less likely to burn. And part of this is what we call the dead fuel equilibrium. This is when it has the same amount of moisture as its environment. And this way there's no moisture exchange. There's no absorption of moisture. There's no evaporation out of the fuels. And so that equilibrium means that the odds of it burning also go down. And so when humidity is higher, fuels tend to become more moist and thus less likely to burn, and vice versa. So that is the idea of fuel equilibrium. There's also a time lag. So as the environment changes, it takes time for fuels to reach equilibrium again. So think of changes across the day. Fuels are much more likely to be absorbing moisture that is available at night when they're drier, and they tend to have their most moisture in the morning and then dry out over the day. What we look at when we're determining how quickly a fire is going to move is something called 1 hour fuels. So this looks at fuels smaller than half an inch in diameter, which reach equilibrium in about an hour. When we have a lot of 1 hour fuels on the ground, we know that they're going to dry out a lot quicker. They're finer, but they'll also have equilibrium faster as well. So when we're thinking through fire behavior and we're thinking about what fire is going to look like on the landscape in that WUI area, we're looking at dead fuel moisture and the size of fuels on the potential burn. So factors that impact dead fine fuels. Weather, time, topography, and composition, right? So back to that triangle that we talked about earlier, that weather triangle. Temperature, shade, and wind all impact moisture in the fuels, right? So if it's really hot, we have a lot of evaporation. If it's in the shade, evaporation is slower, and that can include cloud cover, by the way. And then, of course, wind increases evaporation, decreasing moisture, right? We live in a place that gets a lot of wind here in San Luis Obispo. So we also talked about the fact that topography has an effect. So south-facing slopes dry out faster. Higher elevations actually have greater moisture content. As you go up higher and higher, you tend to be cooler. So you tend to keep more moisture. And then narrow canyons provide more shade and are cooler than wider canyons or just a flat face. Moisture, there's always higher moisture. In the mornings, there's always higher moisture because there is more moisture because it's cooler at night. And then, of course, seasons, depending upon what your season is like. So tighter packed fuels like packed pine needles actually have slower evaporation. So if you have a good example is a bale of hay. If that bale of hay has been tightly packed like it's supposed to be, like super tightly packed, you actually don't lose hardly any moisture, and it's also less likely to burn. If your hay bales are actually a little loose, they're much more likely to burn. And grasses are fine fuels, and large recent fallen trees are larger fuels. So at the beginning of the quarter, I talked about, how would you start a fire? You'd put some grass and other fine fuels on it first. You wouldn't just try to light a giant log. That applies here as well. So when we're thinking about the behavior of fire in the WUI, we need to be thinking about these things. And by the way, part of these fuels is the built environment. How many trees, how many bushes do you have? How much weeds do you have? Is it been dried out? Is it mowed? Do you have a lot of ladder fuels? How are these things connected to each other? How close are these fuels to your house? What is your house built out of? What is your roof? Is it composite? Is it shingle? Is it one of the old-timey houses that has wood siding and a wood roof? Those are going to burn much quicker than if you have stucco and metal roofing. What kind of access is there for fire on your porches and on your front porch? Do you have a lot of plants right around your house that can act as a ladder fuel to get up into the eaves of your house? So when we think about topography, when we think about fuels, when we think about composition of the built environment, these same ideas come into play. So coming right back to this fire behavior triangle, this one of the reasons, because we have to think about all of these different things in the built environment, and every household can be different, by the way. I mean, you might have communities that are all built the same. They're all like the ticky-tacky houses that are all kind of exactly the same. but from community to community, it can be different. So when we think about how do we do research and understand wildland-urban interface fires, taking all these factors into account can be difficult because there's not necessarily consistency in how communities are built, whether they're built as an interface or occluded or as an intermix. And so it's almost a place-by-place examination of what's going on. And that is the reason why, while we're seeing a lot of increase in the amount of wildland-urban interface research that's happening, it's not as easy because we have a much broader complexity of factors. And then we also have these human beings that happen to be involved. And I will tell you, as a sociologist, predicting individual human behavior is not easy. I mean, we can look at large group behaviors and see general trends, but individuals, they do things that we don't always anticipate. And that can impact our ability to understand wildland interface fires too. But we have to do something. And that's where fire policies come into place. Fire policies are our attempt to try and create some consistency and requirements across space in order to protect particularly the built environment, but also the wildlands. You know, our wildlands are incredibly important resources, and protecting them in a way that is good for those ecosystems and good for the people living there is really important. So that brings us to our third and final triangle. So we have 3 triangles. And that is our WUI focus areas for policy and research triangle. This is our policy triangle. And so here we can see that there are 3 sides: mitigation, preparedness and response, and recovery. So we start with mitigation. This is trying to figure out what we can do to prevent WUI fires. And so we do a lot of this through development policy, building codes, and then make sure that we're prepared to respond to fires in WUI spaces and are able to respond, and then what the response is, and then also think through the recovery process. So we want to identify effective management strategies, determine socio-political economic constraints to those strategies, provide potential solutions to overcome those constraints, and monitor implementation of strategies and adjust as needed. So this is our policy triangle, and that is our goal with policy. So one of the things that we do is, you guys have all seen the fire danger index. You guys have all seen the fire danger index. You live in California, you have seen this your whole life. This is the fire danger reading. This is talking about what is the level of potential of a fire. So what is this index telling us? This is taking into account current and antecedent weather, fuel types, both live and dead fuel moisture on the landscape. And it is building a rating system out of that. So it's telling us about the conditions that are on the ground and how they think things happen. Talks about fire behavior. And so like low fire danger means that the fuels would not necessarily ignite easy from small embers, but a more intense heat source such as lightning could start a fire. Whereas when you get to very high, it's where fires will start very easily. Fires will spread rapidly and quickly increase in intensity right after ignition. A small fire, even from something like a campfire ember, could spread very rapidly, which is why once we start to get into the severe, here in California, we don't let campfires happen, because those embers that pop out of your campfire, that float away could actually start a forest fire. And so we have a bunch of different people that monitor this. Fire severity maps we get from CAL FIRE. We talked about that a couple slides ago. And they reflect on a regular basis of what the conditions in that location are like on average, right? So over months. And that's how we get that fire severity index. Now, local communities can actually do their own mapping. Those gray areas we saw that I was talking about, like in Arroyo Grande and San Luis Obispo, we could do our own maps or we can adopt CAL FIRE's. Areas in gray on that FRAP map are doing their own. Excuse me. So one of the important things that we talk about when we talk about WUI zones is defensible space. This is from the CAL FIRE pamphlet that you'll be using for your wildland urban interface assessment. And so when we think through the zones, we talk about zone 0, 1, and 2, and then sometimes we talk about zone 3, depending upon what your property looks like, and how much control you have of those spaces. Almost everybody has control of zone 0. This is within 5 feet of your house. And so in zone 1, you want to think about what is right up against your house. Do you have wood decks or cement decks or a cement pad? Do you have lots of plants right up against your house that might lead to incursion into your house? Do you have dog doors? I got to tell you, dog doors, important to consider because fire can get into your house through your dog doors. Zone 1 is 30 feet. Most property owners in a wildland urban interface have a zone 1. They have some control of that. You might have houses that are a little bit closer, but most of them have front yards and backyards. So again, you want to think about what's in that zone that might be flammable, and then anything outside that 30 feet is what we consider zone 2, and that's up to 100 feet from your house. So factors that we need to consider when we're planning communities, and we have a growing amount of policies around that. For instance, there are vegetation policies about how many weeds or how big the weeds can get up around your house. There's weed abatement laws here in California to help reduce wildfire. But other things that we can think about occur with zoning. So the location of the community, right? There are things that we can control. So power lines, human choices, and building structures are all things that we can control. There are other things like, where are we going to get water to fight this fire from, that we can control as well. And so when we think about where to build communities, where it is in the relationship to ignition sources and into fuels becomes important. One of the things that we always should be thinking about is how fire likes to travel, right? Heat rises. That's just physics. Heat rises. And so if you stuck your house here especially if it's a steep hill, that fire is going to travel up pretty quickly. If you're downhill and there's a fire above you, you also have to be aware of burning chunks of stuff rolling downhill. Gravity also plays a role in this. We're much more likely to have wind go up and kind of feed this. I want you to think about when we were talking about hearths and we were talking about fireplaces and chimneys and things like that. And we have the air come in the bottom and it goes up the chimney, right? Like that's part of that flow because that's how fires behave. We also have laws that require sources of water like fire hydrants. And depending upon where you are, if you're having your own water storage, say you're on a well, we have rules about what kind of water tanks you can get. We have moved away from a lot of fiberglass tanks because they melt and ruin the source of water a lot more quickly than the metal ones do. We can also think about structural placements. So this house, I'm sure, has the most amazing view of whatever's out this way. but look at the chimney this house has been built on. And they have a beautiful wood deck right up against their house. A fire is going to travel up this very quickly on that wood deck, despite them having, it looks like stucco and proper roofing. That wood deck is going to be a source where they're going to catch on fire. This is an example of a interface community. You can see how there's like a clear demarcation of that community that's really thought through the relationship with this hillside. So you can see that this hillside is all full of fine fuels, right? And it's dry. There's some green bushes up here and everything like that, but a lot of this is dry. But this is a pretty big road, right? So you can easily get 2 cars and cars parked on the side. So this is like 3 lanes of cars that can get through here. Plus they've got this walking space. So if that fire comes up here, this becomes a fire break. It reduces the amount of radiant heating that would come up. This landscaping is probably watered a lot, so it has a lot of moisture in it as opposed to these fuels over here. And this is part of the reason why we shouldn't be building our homes in saddles. This is a saddle that has a chimney effect. And then you want to definitely build your home with an intentional fire break. Whereas community that we looked at way back here, right? This, not much of a fire break. This is not much of a fire break between that wildland and those houses. Granted, this area looks a lot flatter, but this is still not a lot of space between these houses and this potential fuel source. So that's something important that we need to be thinking about. We also have all kinds of rules around building material. This is called structure hardening. So historically, policies focused on the materials used in the buildings, which were important. Like, I don't know, you couldn't build your chimney out of wood. Remember, many weeks ago now, I talked about some of our earliest fire policies when we were talking about the urban landscape. And one of the earliest ones in Massachusetts in the early 1600s was, you cannot build your chimney out of wood. You have to use brick because it was catching houses on fire, and that was catching the community on fire. So that's important. So building materials here in California, we think in terms of roof type, siding, decking and fences, landscaping, and the need to build ignition resistant communities. So this is actually in North Carolina. So this is on the East Coast. They get a lot more moisture there on a lot more regular basis. But if you build something like this here in California, one is actually illegal because you're not allowed to have shake roofing anymore. And this siding is old and dried out anyways, but this would catch on fire really quick as opposed to a home like this. So this is considered a best practices structure. I want you to think, so this is an example of an intermix, right? So there's houses, there's a house up here, and I happen to know there's like a house down here. But so this is an intermix example. So this is their driveway. Whoops. You can see that they have, they have this beautiful open bay and everything like that, but their vegetation is very much cleared around their house. They have stucco as the main building materials in the areas that are exposed to the wildlands. You can see this goes all the way over here. This is a great open space. They have a lot of space back here, and these fuels around them are kept very low. And this tree looks like it's kind of close, but really it comes to about here. So even if this tree caught on fire, embers falling is going to be mostly in this area. So this is an example, and this, by the way, is their garage. So this is an example of a house that has really been constructed with best practices in mind. So we're going to watch a short video because one of the issues California is having is our insurance crisis. And that's because of fires in California and it being more and more expensive. And This video is talking about the community impacts of fire, right? So fires happen in communities. All right.
The largest fire in Sonoma history burned through here last October. Sorting through what the fires leave behind has become a regular part of life in California.
That was my room. That was my bed. My grandma had that bed since before I was born. I don't even like being here right now. I don't like looking at it.
California has always burned, but 3 years of back-to-back fires have taken a devastating toll, and an insurance crisis is unfolding.
I'm happy to have survived it, but, I'm very unhappy that I lost all my neighbors.
While no one died in the latest fire, people in Sonoma County have to make a choice: live with the risk or leave for good. This is the last home standing on a ridge that was swallowed up by the Kincaid Fire, the 2019 season's most destructive blaze. Its survival is possibly thanks to the handmade fire defenses Chris Arai has installed over the past several years.
The house has a metal roof, it has a stucco exterior, 10,000-gallon water tank. We have a fire gel that we apply to the windows. The off-grid system, massive batteries.
10 miles down the road, Michelle Hall's family has nothing left.
It didn't really hurt the trees. It just got all of our buildings and our structures. I don't want to look at anything that's going to remind me of this ever again. I just want it to be over with and be able to move on.
The sudden blaze may have been started by a faulty wire maintained by the electric company PG&E. It destroyed hundreds of homes and businesses.
I was asleep, and about 3 o'clock in the morning, I got a call that Soda Rock was on fire.
This 150-year-old winery that is a local landmark burned to the ground.
I was in pretty much shock for the next 4 or 5 days, just not knowing what to think.
Kincaid spread across 120 square miles. It was the season's most destructive fire. No one died, but no one knew what they would come home to.
I get to the bottom of where our driveway actually starts, and I could see the corner of the building. And it was still in its original color with what looked like a bit of roof on it, thinking, well, that's a good sign. And I just got out of the truck and ran up the hill.
Arai had reason to worry. About 2 months before the fire, his insurance company sent him a warning.
We got a letter that they were going to drop our policy. I mean, it was like a one-sentence reason. That they just decided we were too high risk for them. Definitely the DIY aspect saved the house.
An electrical engineer, he dedicated himself to building a home that could withstand wildfires. He poured the concrete basement just before the 2004 Geysers fire ripped through the area. 15 years later, as the Kincaid fire loomed, the sheriff and multiple fire crews warned him to evacuate immediately.
So our original intent was to ride it out down here. And Tess asked me, are you sure that we're going to survive? And I said, well, I can't be 100% sure. I'm 95 plus.
He used every waking minute to prepare the house, boarding up windows and smearing them with flame-repellent gel.
It's what's called a hydrogel.
His off-the-grid solar panels powered a sprinkler system that surrounds the property.
So these sprinklers have a radius of about 45 feet. So they can put a fair bit of water down out there that keeps those lower fuels from catching.
But as the wind shifted, Arai knew it was time to leave. He jumped in his car and drove down the hill. 3 hours later, the embers began to fall like snowflakes. This is footage from a camera that he set up right before he left.
I would definitely ride it out now. Absolutely, because now I know that the house didn't burn.
Arai is one of over 350,000 California homeowners who've been dropped by insurance companies in the past 2 years, in what some experts have called a crisis. Michelle Hall, now without a home, hasn't been able to get insurance for years. A local charity is helping her pay for accommodation while her family figures out what's next.
So the companies, a lot of them wouldn't even, like you said, touch our house. They said, absolutely not. We're not going to insure you. It's too high risk.
One of the few heirlooms to make it out in their rapid evacuation was the 100-year-old deed to their homestead.
I, Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States of America, in the year of our Lord 1916.
Generations of her family grew up here.
I learned to hunt, trap, play in the dirt, watch out for rattlesnakes.
But a century after settling in California, the Hall family is ready to say goodbye.
The fires, they're helping push me, and the high cost of living. That's probably the number one reason. Because if we wanted to move into town, we couldn't do it.
By one estimate, thousands of residents have fled Sonoma County over the past 2 years, the biggest drop on record. This latest fire hit during the grape harvest, which is also peak tourism season. So even those who didn't own property felt the impact in weeks of lost wages and rolling blackouts.
A lot of people, they got evacuated, so they couldn't work for 1 week or 2 weeks. A lot of people were out of work. So we're trying to help all those kind of families. They really, really need help.
Corazon Healdsburg, a local charity, set up a free store to provide necessities like diapers, socks, and paper towels. Moody's estimates it cost the average resident $765. Businesses in the evacuation zone lost an average of $16,000. Overall, Sonoma took about a $725 million hit, and the county is preparing to sue PG&E, California's electrical utility, for damages. For a local staple called the Jimtown store, the losses have been too great to bear.
The reason I haven't quit earlier is because of all the people.
3 decades ago, Carrie Brown and her late husband bought what was once a 19th century general store. Her sister is the manager, and many employees are local college students.
It's more than just a little cafe and a roadside destination. It really, really is like a heart and soul for our community.
On December 30th, 2019, the Jimtown store closed its doors for the last time.
To all, thank you for 28 wonderful years.
Even for those who escaped the flames, the future is still uncertain. Across the state, an insurance crisis is unfolding. Multiple reports suggest that recent wildfires have wiped out decades of profits for the industry. In December, as insurers continued to drop policies, the state of California stepped in. It temporarily blocked them from cutting off close to 1 million more customers in 2020. Meanwhile, Silicon Valley has offered a technological solution. The startup Zesty AI uses artificial intelligence to help insurance companies more accurately assess risk.
From all indicators and all the researchers and scientists, this is, you've heard it over and over again, the new normal.
David Shu, who was a firefighter for more than 30 years, consults with the company.
So you're not giving up on California?
No, not at all. No, I don't think so at all. It's just the fact that we have to think differently about the way we've done things.
Zesty's platform rated the Soda Rock winery as high risk for fire, even though no one else expected it to burn.
Usually the vineyards provide a pretty good fire break, and so I was not overly concerned, to be honest.
Until now, insurance companies have relied on models based on historical fire data and low-resolution satellite imagery, making them more likely to drop policies for entire zip codes. Zesty uses dozens of data points, including building records, roof shape, and distance to flammable vegetation, to estimate a property's risk.
There's many different layers of information that can be gleaned to assess the vulnerability of a structure to a wildland fire.
It could become an indispensable tool for those who wish to remain in a landscape that will continue to be reshaped by fire.
The public has to accept the fact that if you choose to live in a fire-prone environment, it is a constant piece of work that you have to maintain your structure. You have to constantly work on your property for vegetation clearance and setbacks and defensible space.
Despite the devastation, the team at Soda Rock Winery reopened almost immediately.
So I said, well, we got some wine, we got the barn, I got some planks, I got some barrels. Why don't we just open? And we did.
Today, a glass of Merlot can be paired with fresh roasted walnuts. Chris Arai is already preparing for next time.
Are you willing to play these odds year after year?
Now I'm confident.
Michelle and her father are ready to leave.
So what do you think is next for you guys?
I think moving to Idaho.
Idaho might sound appealing. Idaho is actually having exactly the same problems that we're having, including a lot of questioning around insurance agencies because they have a lot of wildlands and a lot of wildland urban interface. And also a lot of Californians have recently moved up to Idaho and have driven up the prices of everything. So Idaho is beautiful, but also having a fire problem and an insurance crisis. All right. So mitigation is all of the policies that we've just talked about. How do we structure our buildings in ways that help prevent them from burning? How do we make sure that we're thinking about our landscaping? And of course, you don't always have control over that. You know, a lot of us have neighbors, and yeah, we don't always have control over that. So all right, so wildfire response. There's a lot of pre-planning that goes into figuring out how we need to respond to a wildfire. So if you were here in 2023 here in San Luis Obispo, you might have seen or heard about the fire that started right behind SLO High School. Now you should know that CAL FIRE and San Luis Obispo Fire and our local forest agents, because we have Los Padres, and so a lot of those agencies actually work together, have had plans for years on how to respond to a fire in that location. So part of what they think about is size and range of the hazard, knowing both the wildland and structural firefighting, equipment overlaps that are needed, and public education. So over here in this land use planning tools to reduce wildfire risk, we can think about landscaping regulations. So we have requirements around property owners need to maintain their vegetation. There are actually fines and fees that you can get if you are cited, if you have not maintained your property. And then of course we have forest management projects, which is reducing fuels, which we talked about at the ranch. We also want to think about watershed management plans, reducing fire through fuels treatments and our water sources, and thinking about how do we maintain these water sources. We have lots of building codes that come into play. Of course, we have steep slope ordinances, which means you're not allowed to build houses in certain places. A lot of those codes have actually recently changed. They've gotten a little bit more strict. We have all of our zoning codes that come into place, including around fuels breaks and how you can build buildings, where you can build buildings, what kind of structures you can use, what all that looks like. And of course, we have subdivision standards, especially around road widths, access points. While nobody has actually stuck in additional access points into where the Oakland Hills fire is, We have a lot more rules today about having additional access points into communities. So it's not just one road everybody is trying to get in and out of, because that can create a serious traffic jam. It can also prevent responses. And of course, working with local governments and local agencies to prepare. So we have a lot of this mitigation. Every single area in San Luis Obispo has actually been pre-planned on how they're going to fight that fire, and what they're going to concentrate on, what that looks like. And so that way, when a fire happens, not if, but when a fire happens, they know what they're going to do. And so that brings us to response. So it's on fire, yo. Now what are we going to do? Well, we need to think about coordinating our response. So we have to think about manpower. There is a big difference in how we fight structural fires in cities and how we engage in wildland urban interface firefighting. If you were going to go fight a structural fire, you would see that you have all this breathing equipment and how you're thinking through that space. You're still using the same ideas of topography and fuels and everything like that, but your topography and fuels are vastly different than if you're fighting a forest fire. So you have to have some idea of what's going on there. We have a lot of coordination that happens, especially when we have multiple agencies responding. There are fires that may have between 5,000 and 10,000 people responding to them. And so how you engage in that firefighting can be very different. And it's not just, I need people to show up and put out the fire. It's, where are we getting all the equipment from? Do we have an accurate map of every single water source in this area so we know where we're going? Do we have an accurate map of every road and every structure? Who's going to respond where? What can we save? What do we need to sacrifice? CAL FIRE, by the way, is not going to come save you if you decided to stick around and defend your property as a raging fire comes towards you. It's very sad that you're making that choice. And if you make it through, great. But they're making a calculated risk. When they tell you to evacuate, it means get out. It doesn't mean, I think I'm going to stick it out and fight this fire. That's a choice, but you cannot expect them to come defend you. They're also not going to risk their lives to save your house if it's not considered a viable defensible space. They're also coordinating with the public, right? So we have evacuation orders. We get a lot of those today on our phones, but you have to have a phone. Yeah, you have to have a phone in order to get that. And there's lots of people, if you're poor or very young or very old, you might not have a cell phone, or you might not know what that means. That might be very confusing to you, especially if you're an older person and are not sure what's going on. So especially if you have issues like dementia, that can be very confusing. Also, it might not be in a language that you speak. So if you don't read in the language that the message was sent on, you may not know what to do. So when we're thinking through how to communicate to the public, we need to think through, who are all the stakeholders in our community? How do we communicate to them in a way that will get the message to them? And by the way, evacuations are usually done by law enforcement, not fire. So this is something that the sheriff's department and local PDs will be taking care of. We also need to be thinking about communicating to the public fire spread and damage, and how do we engage in the recovery process. So we are going to watch a short video on how they fought the Lizzie fire in San Luis Obispo. And this is raw footage. So yeah. So you can see how close it is to the high school. Like this is feet away from the high school. And you can see how those flames are traveling uphill, right? That's where this fire is going. It's going up. And you can see that the flames in the grass fire are actually pretty low. These are only a few feet. I don't know if any of you will recognize this community. This is out over by the hospital. And you can see that, you know, some of these thicker plants, they're taking longer to burn. That's because of the fuel moisture, and this rainbow is because they're spraying water on it. So they're thinking about how they're going to put line out there, how they're going to spray water out there. What do the fuels look like? What is the best plan of attack? So the water source is at this house, and they're going to walk on out there and start spraying down the fire. You can see, compared to this guy, these flames are actually pretty low, and he's out there spraying them down. And here we have an example of a spot fire. Now this gentleman is going to put that out. But I do want to point out a couple things, right? So here we have a spot fire. We have it in bark. Sometimes bark can be very flammable, but we have these wood posts here. If this was in the right spot, all of this wood can catch on fire and continue the fire towards the house. Now, fortunately, he saw that ember come out and was like, oh, I better put that out. But you can also see the fire is back here on the other side of his house. Now, you can look at the difference between these prickly pears and the grass. These guys have a lot more moisture than the grass does. Remember, this is happening in late October. And here we have some Cal Fire planes dropping retardant to try and prevent the fire from spreading. But this is what the grass fire looks like. And here's an example of a bunch of spot fires. You can see all these embers raining down that are causing these spot fires. This is one of the biggest ways that fire actually spreads, is through spot fires. Now, we happen to be very lucky that day
I just saved the fireman.
that the wind wasn't blowing. That guy's very helpful, directing the fire to the spot fires. You can see all this wood, this potential fire. But here he's got cement. I'm not sure the bike helmet is helping, but sure. In a minute, we're going to see some of these manzanita trees go up. See, there's another spot fire getting really close to that fence. That fence catches on fire. It's going to travel right up to the house. And then we're going to have a structural fire. But they've been smart about their landscaping, right? They've got this big cement area. You can see the plane over there. And it's pretty low. They can check and see what's going on. They have a pool. They're actually throwing all their cushions in the pool.
Come on, drop, buddy. There you go. Good job.
That's helping prevent the fire from spreading. The air support is coming right out of Paso, so they're really close in order to help respond to this. The green trucks are the fire service. Okay, so this is a eucalyptus going up. Eucalyptus are full of oils. There is no point in trying to put out that eucalyptus. It is gone. I know they're trying to prevent the embers from coming off of it. So eucalyptus will kind of have little uke bombs that'll come off and spread fire. And that's what they're looking for. Oh, there's one over in the corner. Spot fire. There's another one. There's another one. You can see all these spot fires happening with that eucalyptus going up. Oh, there's another one. There's another one. And you can see how close to the high school this is. Breaking out the Pulaskis. That's a Pulaski. They're out there overturning the landscape. You're going to be a wildland firefighter. I also want you to notice the gear that they're wearing. Yep, that uke is gone. Yeah, they're going to need a lot of water on this hillside. But you can bury fires. See, they have hose pulled. This is from that uke going up and spreading all of that. So that's some of the ways that we can fight and have a response to fires. It is very hands-on when we're talking about wildland fires. Finally, we have post-fire, right? So this is the recovery phase. So here in California, the recovery phase oftentimes involves insurance agencies, the federal government. There's a lot of consequences of wildfire, of WUI fires in particular. The first is to the residents and the community. I mean, there's some obvious ones like the tragic loss of property, the loss of animals, the potential loss of life. People do pass in fires. In the Paradise Fire, 87 people lost their lives. But it's not just houses that burn down, it's all the infrastructure in the area as well. So roads, power lines, phone lines, cell towers, water resources, waste management treatment plants, all of those are also damaged. So in order to actually recover from a fire, we have to rebuild all of that infrastructure. I mean, the roads, fires can be hot enough that the roads actually melt. You also have this incredibly toxic waste that results from our built environment. We use a ton of chemicals in our built environment, and that not only affects the firefighters because they're breathing all of that toxic stuff, but it's in our smoke that we breathe as well. When we're breathing smoke, that's all that toxic stuff from those houses and cars. And all the chemicals and everything like that. We also have community diaspora happening. So when a community burns down and there's nowhere for anybody to live, they leave. And when they leave, we have the desecration of these communities, and rebuilding them can also be very tough, especially when we're talking about the ability of people to rebuild. And also you can't actually go in and clean up this mess. You actually have to hire people that are specially trained to clean up toxic messes, because post-fire is a toxic mess. And because we've damaged a lot of the vegetation, we actually increase the risk of runoff and mudslides. There is often, and there will be for that hillside, a warning about that hillside sliding that we just watched in slow. And of course, there's the physical and the mental impacts on responders. Firefighting is a tough profession. And a lot of times you're fighting fires in your own community because you're the first responder on the scene. And so that can be really tough, especially if you're losing your own house, your families are part of that diaspora. Now what are you going to do? And of course, there's a lot of consequences to the ecosystem. We need to think about habitat and plant recovery. And so the process of post-fire response is also incredibly multi-agency. It requires a whole host of expertise in order to help a community recover. And part of the policies that we have with FEMA, in California, we have our own disaster agencies, are trying to help people actually recover and be able to continue, maybe be able to continue to live in that community or go back to that community, or at least be able to find places where they can also live. And so when we think of wildfire response, we need to think of those three policies. So I hope you found this interesting. You learned a bit about what is a wildland urban interface, some of the potential issues that we face when we talk about fires, as well as our policy triangle. I hope you guys have a good day.